have two more presentations, and the next one is about forensics. We have Professor Prevelakis from Braunschweig, and he's going to be talking about working with digital forensics. So, for the first.
Hi. So, overview of this presentation. I will have a brief introduction to digital forensics. Then I'm going to talk about data acquisition, which is actually quite important. And finally, file system analysis, which was actually what I want to talk about today. So what is digital forensics? So before the digital era, when a crime was committed, the investigators had to collect evidence that could be brought to the court and convince the court and the jury of the claims made by the prosecution. So, traditional law enforcement would get a search warrant. They would impound all documents, records, tapes, whatever, bring them to a central location, examine them. If you look at videos from recent raids during a bank investigation, you have seen people carrying boxes of stuff to cars to take them to the police headquarters. So this would amount to a mountain of data, of forensic material, and then the investigators would examine them and they would build a case based on what they found. So both sides can question the authenticity or the intent or the reasons behind the data collected. And in many cases, experts would be called to help. For example, handwriting experts would examine the signatures or the right of handwritten documents to determine whether they were written by the people accused or whatever. In the current situation, we still have a lot of physical evidence because despite all these paperless office claims, we still have a lot of stuff printed. But a lot is stored in digital format. The University of California study claims that 90% of new information is born digital. So if that is printed or made physical at some stage, that would be part of the physical evidence, but most of the stuff that we need to look at nowadays is digital. So we need to examine the data, but in order to examine it, we need to find it. So it might not be readily available. And we need to convince the court that the evidence is real, that we did not fake. For example, if we claim that somebody received an email, can we present a log file saying the mail was delivered at the mailbox on September 27th at 0900, and it was read on September 27, 10:15, then that would present prima facie evidence that the person that we claim to have known this information had read the email. But we could fake it. I mean, that's a log file. We could say VI and change the data and save it back. So we might fake it outright, or we might accidentally modify something. For example, if we open a document with Word, which is my favorite example, it will make changes to the file, even though we don't actually make any change. If we just open it for reading, Word might make changes to the file, and and then it will ask us whether we want to save it, and if we say yes, it will overwrite the original file with what it has done, and that will destroy the access data, access dates, and access information. So we need to make sure that whenever we look at this digital data, we don't actually mess with it. So we need to maintain the chain of custody. So, two definitions One is the electronic record. What is an electronic record? It's data that we need to preserve. It's evidence in digital format. Computer forensics is an examination, a scientific examination of data held on or extracted from computer media, computer storage, in such a way that we can use this information in a court. Because fundamentally, at the end of the day, this information, even if we use it to identify a suspect, we need to convict this suspect. If we just identify a suspect and nothing comes of it, then we have not done our forensics work properly. So digital evidence is any data stored or transmitted using a computer that supports or refutes the theory that we come up with. So how an offense has been committed, or aspects of the offense, and so on and so forth. Digital evidence is extremely fragile. We have to be very careful not to destroy it. Very similar to fingerprint or DNA evidence for that matter. It's also latent in the sense that in its natural form, it's not visible. If I show you a CD and say this proves my case, it doesn't tell you anything because you cannot read the CD. You have to need a machine to mount the CD and then look at the information stored in it. So we are doing a conversion. We are converting digital data into a visual form that we can see, and most importantly, the jury can see. And we have to be sure that this conversion is honest. Digital evidence is often time sensitive in the sense that if you look at network information or connections or whatever, these, as time goes by, change. So we need to store them and preserve them for presentation. Also, digital evidence can transcend borders because we have the global network. And that presents its own sets of problems with respect to discovery, finding them and collecting them, and to proving that proving that the chain of custody has been maintained. So there are different types of investigation. So we don't need to go all the way for every type of investigation. So some of them are internal investigations. So the company thinks that something is done wrong. For example, there's a leak, or some employees copying data and giving it to the competition or whatever. So in that case, it's easy because they're looking at their own equipment, so they don't need to get permission from anybody. Usually, employees have to sign forms when they're hired that they cannot present any objections to their hard drives, or their corporate equipment being examined, and so on and so forth. So in most of these cases, we can find and review everything that we need to. The second case is civil. So this is a little bit more difficult, and we have a conflict between two parties, but this is settled in civil courts. So the proof, the requirement for proof is less stringent as in the third case. So we just need to convince the jury. In the third case, the criminal, here we have the highest stakes, because we have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. And that means that we better be super convincing, otherwise our case will not succeed in court. So we have one example might be child pornography, which is a good example because it's contained. There is no secondary proof. If you have in possession this material, or if you're distributing it, then you're guilty. So that's very contained. Other cases, for example, the case of I think it was between two firms with self-driving cars, where one employee moved from one firm to the other. Now that is a very, very tricky environment, because you have to get discovery for both parties, and you have to prove not beyond reasonable doubt, but you have to convince the jury that the claimant actually suffered damage from that infringement. So you need to look at a lot of forensic data to see when the data was moved from one company to the other, if it was moved, how it was moved, and whether the company knew that this was happening. Because it could be that the employee might have taken a laptop from his previous company and just took it to the new company, so the data are inside the laptop and might not be the knowledge of the other company. So it's very complex. But child pornography is a good example. So if the police raids a house of somebody that is suspected of having in his possession or her possession child porn, we need to confiscate the discs, and we need to make sure that when we go to court, the defendant cannot claim that we tampered with the evidence. And here we'll see the interesting methodology that we have to follow in order to ensure that it can stand up in court. So here we see the incident response, what we do once we have the incident, once we are faced with an incident of a digital of a crime that requires digital forensics, the methodology that we have to follow, and I'm just going to discuss a little bit the guidelines for forensic tools issued by the National Institute for Standards in the US. So we have a bunch of incidents. So we see malicious code, unauthorized access, denial of service that we discussed in the previous session, misuse of resources, espionage, and that includes industrial espionage, as in the case of the cars, and even hoaxes. The forensic methodology is based around the law of the 3 A's: acquire, authenticate, analyze. So before we can do anything, then we need to be sure that we copied it in a way that did not change them, and then we have to analyze them in order to build up our case against the defendant. We have to be very careful of self-bias, because we don't want to have an assumption or some favorite result, and then we try to massage the evidence to support it. We need to let the evidence guide us to a conclusion or some kind of idea of what happened. The Lockhart's principle says that anything or anyone entering a crime scene takes something or leaves something behind. So just by going into the crime scene, you might be contaminating it. So if you, in a physical case, your shoes might contain material that you bring from outside to the crime scene, which will then be discovered and thought it would be part of the crime scene when one of the investigators brought it with him or her unknowingly. Taking out, again, you might move something, you might interfere. With a computer, just accessing, just mounting, if you accidentally mount a drive, you have a flash, and you mount it on your computer, things will happen, and it will change it. And we must prevent this from happening. So, finally, the more evidence we gather, the better. In fact, if we could get everything, that would be the ideal environment. But we can't, because we don't have infinite storage or time, so we need to have as much as we can afford to. Again, the jury is influenced by the amount of data. It's better to have 2 pieces of evidence rather than 1. Once we have once we are involved in the incident, we need to go through the, all the source of the evidence and the people involved and check the reliability of the information. So we need to be sure that we're getting, that the information we're getting is reliable. And we perform an initial fact checking. We need to determine what needs to be preserved and what cannot be preserved. Because like, as I said, ideally we want to preserve everything. So we try to get as much as we can. And finally, we need to follow certain procedures to make sure that we don't contaminate the evidence. Safety is a very important issue. Let me give you an example. When a big telephone company realized that somebody had installed unauthorized software in a number of its switches, the machines that handle the calls, they had to make a decision, and they had to make it very quickly. Did they reboot or reinstall the manufacturer's software on these machines, thereby alerting the bad guys that they were onto them? Or would they want to maintain the existing situation in order to gather as much evidence as they can, as they could, from the infiltrators? They chose the first because of safety, because they did not want the intruders to have any control over their telecommunications infrastructure, so they immediately reinstalled the software, and the attackers disappeared. So finally, we need to be sure that everything is mapped and recorded. In a physical situation, we need to have photographs and diagrams. In a digital situation, we need to know where, for example, if we collect 10, 20 disk drives, we need to know where they were located physically and which machines, whether it was the CEO computer or the secretary's computer or whatever. So even in a digital situation, we need to know where we got it from. So identification or seizure. We need to decide what we need to seize and in what order. So what is the priority? This is quite important because as I said, data might degrade over time. So we need to gather most of the important stuff quickly and isolate it so that they don't get contaminated or degraded. Consider access logs. If you go and you have an incident, if you go the next day or the next hour and connect all the access logs, you're going to get them, as far back as you can. If you wait 6 months, maybe you will not get any logs from the day of the incident, because logs are essentially a sliding window over time. So if you wait to collect this information, you might not get anything, or it might not go far enough into the past. Preservation and integrity. Again, chain of custody is key. We need to make sure that the stuff we collect is treated in such a way as its authenticity cannot be questioned in court. So recovery, again, get it all. The harvesting stage is where we start getting information about the data we collected. So this is the first pass through the collected data. We analyze the data that we have collected during the recovery phase, and we test various theories to see if they are consistent with what we have collected so far. Then we need to reduce the amount of data. So we need to do the reduction, the filtering of information, so information that is that does not help or is not important for that particular case can be left aside. This is because you cannot have a court case that lasts years. You have to be able to present your evidence in court, and it has to be done in a finite amount of time. So you need to get rid of most of the stuff. Finally, we need to cross-reference and validate our findings to make sure that we have a consistent case and our proof is convincing. Finally, we need to do the reporting, where we describe what we've done so far and all the protocols and procedures that we've used to convince, again, the court that the proper steps were taken so that the conclusions are trustworthy. And finally, we need to translate all that and explain it to the court or to the jury. And this is probably the most difficult part. Now, the NIST, the National Institute of Standards, have presented a bunch of minimum requirements. So, the forensic tool shall make a bitstream image. So, we don't want the tool in the first stage, where we actually copy the stuff from the original medium. We don't want interpretation. We just want a binary copy. And the tool has to be able to do that. This is very important, and I'll show you later on why this is so important. The tool shall not alter the original media. Again, the original media is used once to make a copy, and then it's put in a Ziploc bag, sealed, and then put in an air-conditioned storage area. We don't want to touch it again. Every time we touch the original media, we run the risk that a disk error might occur, or drive might fail, or whatever. So we don't want to. We want to copy it once, and we want to leave it alone. Well, the tool should be able to handle the most popular types of disks. ID disks are used on practically every on laptops and small computers and so on. Servers traditionally tend to use SCSI disks, so the tool should be able to access the two popular protocols, and that's a minimum requirement, okay? And it should be able to verify the integrity of the disk. Again, we'll see why this is important, because if disks have errors, a huge disk will have a finite number of sectors that cannot be read, or if they're read multiple times might produce different results, and so on and so forth. So we should be able to verify the integrity of the disk. We should have a log of all the I/O errors. And finally, it needs to have good documentation so that it's used properly. Because it's all about the process. If the process is not correct, then we haven't done anything. It's like a manufacturer of a car, or a spaceship, or an airplane. You have to prove that your manufacturing process ensures the quality of the end product. You cannot just say, I built a car, test it to see if it breaks, because that particular instance might be okay, but the other 10,000 that come off that production line might be faulty. So you need to convince the certification process that your manufacturing process ensures quality. So, chain of custody. What does it mean? It means that evidence is accounted for at all times. So we know exactly where it's been, who is, so we need to have a lot of paperwork. So that drive, the hard drive was moved from that PC, it was taken to this location, where it was copied, then it was put into this locker, and so on and so forth. So passage from one party to another has to be documented, and passage from one location to another has to be also documented. So we create a paper trail of where that piece of digital data has been. So now we move to the second chapter of this presentation, which is data acquisition. How do we gather the stuff that we need to analyze? So we need to distinguish between two large ways of looking at the data: the live system analysis and the dead system analysis. You might think of it as the online analysis and the offline analysis. The difference between the two of them is that in the case of the live, the system is functioning. So on one hand, we can get better or more data. On the other hand, just by having it running, its state is changing. So we have our target is changing, and we're trying to move target. In the case of the dead system analysis, we go to the crime scene, we pull the plug of the computer, it powers down, and then it's dead. So now its state cannot change. So we are on safer ground forensically here, but the live system analysis is more promising. Let me give you an example. Let's say that the disk drive is encrypted. You pull the plug, it's dead. So now you can't access the disk because you don't know the password. If you keep it running, you might be able to look at the RAM and find perhaps the password, or find the key, or find some hints to help you find the key. So by keeping it running, you might get better mileage out of your investigation. If you recall the FBI case with the iPhone, where they were trying to find the PIN, and they were pestering Apple to give them a way to find the PIN for that iPhone, that if they had managed to grab the iPhone while it was unlocked, we wouldn't have to go through that procedure, and it would have finished much quicker. And in many cases, when they want to arrest somebody, the police enforcement might use techniques like techniques used by thieves when they want to steal your cell phone, and distract you and then grab the cell phone. So, or they call you, and while you pick up your cell phone, somebody grabs it. So it's unlocked. So, because once it's locked, then you have to start thinking about how do I break the encryption, how do I break the protection, and how do I break something. And that might take time, or it might be impossible. Actually, the iPhone it was not impossible, so it was a happy end. Most of the techniques that we use refer to dead systems, because, like I said, live systems offer many possibilities of contaminating the forensic data. Now, during a forensic investigation, we need to worry, and this is our persistent headache, is that if we do not collect something, it may be lost. And if it's lost, then obviously we cannot use it as evidence. And if it's not properly collected, then the data might not be as expressive, or it might not be as convincing, or worse, it might be thrown out of court. And during the acquisition phase, as per NIST recommendation, we need to take an exact bitwise copy of the storage medium. Now, in the case of the dead system acquisition, the suspect's operating system is not involved. So we just take the dead system disk and we mount it on our system and extract the data. The live acquisition is done using the suspect's operating system or applications. So it is a live system, and we are cooperating with it. So we have to worry about data modification or producing tampered data. So we might end up with an image that contains no evidence. So this is a dilemma. Should live acquisition be avoided or not? This is an open question. In fact, the Scotland Yard procedures are a little bit conflicting, in the sense that in step 3, they tell you to turn off the PC, and then in step 13 or so, they ask you to evaluate whether the PC should be turned off or not. So they're not quite sure how to deal with this case themselves. Now, if it's live, then you need to establish a secure environment, a trusted environment with which to operate. So you cannot use the system utilities, you cannot trust the operating system of the suspects, because it might be lying to you. You have to make sure not to mount your drives and not to modify data. And you need to consider that the environment that you're working under might be contaminated. It might contain a rootkit, for example, that gives you false evidence or false information. So you need to take all that into account. So once we have decided to extract data from a storage medium, there are two ways of extracting the data. One is to access the hard disk controller directly, and the other one is to go through the BIOS. And I'll explain why there are pros and cons in the two approaches. In the first case, you need to have the appropriate drivers, and you need to be able to make sense of the structure of the system. And don't think of this is a PC running MS-DOS, or this is a PC running Windows, or this is a PC running Linux, or this is a PC running OS X. You might get a VCR with a hard disk, a digital recorder, and the structure of the system might be completely opaque to you. It might contain some internal database and segments of MP4 tracks. And a film might be composed of a huge number of these segments, and how they're spliced together you have to find from the database. So it doesn't have anything to do with an ordinary system that we think of. So that might not be, the choice might not be so clear-cut. So you need to have the appropriate software, and you need to be able to issue the appropriate commands. In the case of the BIOS, we assume that the BIOS knows how to do it. If it's a PC, then it's well documented. If it's some more exotic computer, again, it might have some kind of minimal functionality to read the disk because it has to boot of that device. So we can either use the ROM routings, or we can have our own software. So but the problem is that we may have differences depending on how these things are configured. So here we have a BIOS that thinks that the disk is 8 gigabytes. So if we ask it how big is disk 0, it will respond 8 gigabytes. If we go to the controller and we look at the disk itself, then we might get a different number, say 12 gigabytes. So which one is right? The problem is that if we get a false disk size because of a misconfigured BIOS, then information that at the end of the disk, this last 4 gigabytes will not be copied, so we will have lost evidence. So we need to identify the size of the disk through different methods, and one of the most common ones is to ask the disk drive itself, or look at the model number and the serial number. Once we look at that, we need to be concerned about how the drive is partitioned, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So we need to be confident that we know how big our disk is, so that we can start the process of copying it. Now, once we start the copy process, we might have errors. So let's say that we read a sector, and then this sector is bad. So we get a checksum error or some kind of error, and the controller reports as a failure, as a read failure. And so on. Here we get 2 more good ones, and then a failed one, and then 2 more good ones. So what do we do with the errors? The important thing is to save them in a way that we know that this sector is bad. But we also copy something there because we need to maintain the ordering. So this, even though we have 2 sectors that are filled with zeros, this is still the 5th sector in our copy, as in the original one. If these were not read and not substituted with zeros and we simply moved these to here, then we would lose the ordering. We would not, the absolute addressing of the blocks would be wrong in our copy, and that would confuse the recovery error. So we need to be able to handle errors, we need to be able to log them so that we know that we have errors. And in many cases, if we have too many errors, that might be a hint that the suspect's PC is doing something that we should be looking at more closely. So in some cases, if you can change the firmware on the hard disk drive, it might report wrong checksums until you load the correct one. So you might hide information on the disk in plain sight, and when the investigator tries to read them, they will just appear as bad blocks, when in fact they're perfectly good ones, but the checksum is wrong. So, in general, we need to allow the recovery of data from the storage device without changing the drive's contents. You see I'm repeating this again and again. So we need to make sure that no write commands is allowed to reach the disk drive. So only read commands are allowed to pass. So we need to have a device called a write blocker. So a device that whenever it sees a write request, it ignores it. And there are two types of blockers, the hardware and the software. The hardware is a physical device that you insert between the hard disk drive and the rest of the system, and it merely prevents the ID or SCSI commands that are involved with the write operation. So here we have it. I'm sorry, on my laptop it's much better. Here it's a little bit pale. Here we have a read command. So the controller sends the read command to the device, to the blocker device. The blocker device allows it, and it reads the sector. And then it returns through the blocker the data. If we have a command to write the sector, the blocker will do nothing. It will ignore the command. In the case of software, it's a little bit less clear in the sense that, again, we have to go, let's say, the write request goes to the BIOS, and the BIOS sends the command to the controller, and then the controller sends the command to the disk drive, affecting the write. So this is how it's normally done. If we have the software controller, then when we do the write sector command, it will ignore it, and it will not allow it to go through. So if the software, but here we're just looking at some interrupt or some operating system call that tries to do the write. If the software, that potentially could be malware, bypasses this normal mechanism, it can still write to the disk. So this is less safe, but more convenient. A more recent way, in the case of virtual machines, is to create a virtual machine, like using a common virtual machine environment like VMware, and declare that volume to be read-only, so that VMware essentially is the software write blocker, because VMware will not allow you to write to the disk volume. So in these cases, you assume that the operating system or the software write blocker will do its job. In the case of the hardware blocker, things are more certain. So, in the case of the software blocker, you need to choose a known piece of software with a trusted track record, and you need to know that under no circumstances will it modify the disk, and it will not mess with the disk drive. And we need to essentially do a dry run of the software on a non-production disk to make sure that we understand how it works. And here we have a bunch of software, the read-only mounter for the Mac, the forensic soft, the safe block for Windows, and in Linux, you can mount a file system read-only using the operating system mount command. Now, we need to create a copy of our original disk. Now, we can either create a mirror image of the disk, so we can get another disk and copy the original disk into the new disk. So we can use a physical device that is as close as possible to the original disk in terms of geometry, or we can copy it to a file. In the old days, people would do the disk copy. Nowadays, people prefer the copying files because it's faster. You don't need to keep a lot of disks around, and also it's fragmentable in the sense that if it's too big, it can spill over to other volumes. So you can store it on a big server. If we use a physical disk, we need to wipe the destination disk first. So we have to fill it full of zeros. We don't want any garbage left behind, because if for some reason that block is not written and it contains some old stuff, and then we analyze it, we might come across that block and think we found something, when in fact it's from from another previous use of this disk. So we need to fill it with zeros and then copy the disk. And obviously, we cannot mount the destination disk on the acquisition system because it might be compromised.
Okay, we have the hardware failure.
But while we're waiting for that disk to finish, let me talk about something that is fairly late in the presentation. It doesn't need any slides. Let us consider a disk drive, and we want to hide some information inside that disk drive so that nobody else can accidentally find it. If somebody looks for it, they'll probably find it. But let's say that we want to hide it from the casual observer. Anybody who has taken an operating system course will have heard about fragmentation. Memory fragmentation, disk fragmentation. Whenever we take a linear amount of storage and we start cutting it, slicing it into identically sized chunks, we immediately have the problem of internal fragmentation. So if we have a file that is 150 bytes long and our boxes are 100 bytes big, so we need 2 boxes to put our file, and 50 bytes get left unused at the end of the second box. So these 50 bytes are quite interesting because we can hide stuff in them. Because they are part of the file, they will not be reused by the operating system. They're not marked as, that sector is marked as used because it contains the last part of our file. But, so the operating system is not going to reuse it, but nobody can see this information because it's past the end of the file. If the file increases in size, it will overwrite them. So we have things stored there, but we won't see them. So that's one area where we can hide stuff past the end of the file. Now another area, which is very common with people dealing with boards, is to create partitions that have a little space between them. So you create a Windows partition and a Linux partition, and between them there is some space. Between partitions space, we can go and at the beginning of the disk there is the partition table, which many people will call it slice table, because of the IBM PC history, we have this little table at the beginning of the disk that allows us to define up to 4 areas in the disk. Let's call them slices, and each of these slices can contain a file system. So if we create in the first entry of that table 1 chunk, and then in the second entry we create another chunk, and there is some space in between, then this will not be visible. And because of the way that table is displayed, unless you have a calculator to do the calculations, you might miss the whole. But then if you go to the third entry of that table and put in the correct information, boom, you'll get the invisible partition appear. So here's another case where we have created something out of thin air. The other thing is that whenever you have a buffer in memory and the operating system has a standard size container, and we want to do an operation, let's say write 32 bytes onto create a file of 32 bytes. So depending on how big the operating system buffer is, you might get additional information stored into the disk. So you might get some garbage after your 32 bytes that's stored in the disk and is part of your file. And then if you extract this using a utility like DD, you will find this information. So if the operating system is reusing buffers without cleaning them, and most operating systems don't bother to zeroing, then you might get, yeah. But it also does the VM memory cleaning. So you might get this information as well. And the last area where you can hide stuff is, again, because the operating system has a standard way of arranging stuff in its partitions. You might get, and you say, I want a partition that is, let's say, 25 gigs and change. Now, this change at the end, the operating system might not be able to use. And when you format that, you might get a warning that says that so many sectors are not used, or so at the end, so the unused sectors in a partition might be used to hide stuff, and these are totally invisible because the operating system will not use these sectors because it does not consider them part of its file system. They do not appear as a whole in the slices, and unless you know where to look for them, they will not be visible. So, as we'll see a little bit later how that manifests itself. But as you can see, there are many ways that somebody can hide things in a system. And so we need to know exactly how big the disk is so we can copy every bit, so we can then search this file or this linear array of bytes for strings and stuff like that. So our copy can be the raw image, just the bitwise copy of this aspect of this drive. It can be an embedded image which contains this raw image plus additional stuff such as hash values, dates, times, additional information that we are collecting. And depending on the tool that we use, this image can be compressed, because if we are a basic forensics lab and we start getting terabytes of disks, soon enough we'll run out of space. Now let's look at an obvious way of doing the copy. So DD is a Unix utility that essentially is designed for copying, from reading and writing chunks of data from source media, and can write it either to a device or to an output file. So the default block size is 512 bytes, and essentially we can use this to define the input file and the output file and the block size. We need to be careful because a megabyte is not always a megabyte. So 1M is 1024 by 1024 bytes, while the disk drive, if it's a 30 megabyte disk drive or a 30 gigabyte disk drive, it's 1 million bytes. So you cannot use this 30 megabyte size to copy because it will try to copy too much information and you're going to run off the end of the disk. Two additional commands that are very useful is the count command, which tells you how many blocks to copy, and the skip is how many blocks to skip before you start copying. So you can copy, if you have a disk drive and it has 4 slices, you can skip to the second slice and then copy that slice to a file. So you can deconstruct that huge image into the 1, 2, 3, or 4 partitions inside the disk drive. So you can then mount them separately. However, if we just do the command as I showed you before, and there are bad blocks, you will lose sync. Because if it tries to read the block, it won't be able to do it, but then it will not substitute the bad block with zeros in the output. So we need to do some additional stuff. One is specify no error, so that it doesn't die when it cannot read the sector. And also the sync, so that it will pad bad blocks replace bad blocks with zeros. So the offset in the destination file will be the same as the offset in the source file. And finally, we do not truncate the non-trunc, so we do not truncate the output file. So here you're going to get the command where the input file is file 1 of data. This is the output file. The block size is 512 blocks. So we skip 1000. So essentially we skip 500 K, and then we copy 100 blocks, so we copy 50K, and we do not stop for errors. So that's one way of doing it. It's possible to create an image over the network, and this is quite important because you might, especially if you're dealing with virtual machines, you might not have enough space in your virtual machine to do all that fancy stuff. So you need to be able to copy over the network. And this is actually quite useful because you can pipe the output of DD into SSH, and then you can have DD construct the file on the other end. So here we have, we are reading stuff from a disk, from dev HDA, and then we pass it through SSH to this machine, and there we go to our destination directory, and then we write to file.dd at the other end. And by using appropriate block sizes, we can make this operation faster. Hash values. Now, so far we've shown how to copy stuff, but the problem is that we need to be sure that what we copied has not been corrupted or rearranged or messed with. So we need to calculate hash values for evidence. and then we can prove the integrity of the image. So 2 months down the road, we can run a hash and make sure that this image has not been changed, because we can compare it with the hash we took when we extracted it. And also, if we calculate the hash from our evidence disk, we can compare it with the hash from our copy, and assuming that there are no I/O errors, then the two hashes will be the same. Another way, so that would be a hash for the entire volume. So, and this is a take it or leave it approach, because if anything is changed in the volume, then the hash will be wrong and we won't be able to use it. There's another way of calculating hashes, is to calculate the hash on a per per partition. Inside the volume, we might have partitions, so we might restrict our hash to a partition-sized chunk. Or perhaps if we know the file system, if it's an NTFS, for example, file system, we can take the hash of each file. So we can create a second tree, which is identical to the directory tree, but the contents of the files are not the contents of the files, but just a hash. So we can check to see that the individual files have not been messed with. So now this takes us to the last part of this presentation, which is file system analysis. So the general goal is to look at the hierarchical organization of the data inside the disk or the partition in order to get information. So if we look at a guy who is accused of porn, if we see a file that has nakedchild.png, then that's a big clue that we should be looking at that file. However, life is not as easy as this. We might have more complex cases where we need to prove that an employee, for example, accessed the file at a given time. So we need to look at logs, and some of these logs may have been tampered with, so we need to look at other logs to make sure that the logs that we're looking at have not been tampered with, and so on and so forth. So we might not just look at the contents of the files, and these might be very interesting, but we might also look at the entire organization of the disk and try to get some information out of that. So we can break the stuff that we get from the disk into two broad categories. One is the user data, so that's the picture of the naked child inside the file, and the other one is structural data. And that might be, for example, when the file was created, when it was last accessed. So, the file systems are independent of the hardware and of the operating system. So, Windows can run on FAT or NTFS disks. Linux can use FAT, X2, X3, X4, Riser FS. Android can use X4 or YAPS. So we have a lot of combinations of operating systems and file systems. So we need to be able to look at the file system in order to access the data, the user data, the structure. We might want to reconstruct events that took place in the past by looking at metadata in the file system. And in many cases, or probably in all cases, we cannot use the real operating system. We have to look at it on our own, because we don't want this operating system to mess with our files. For example, if we open a file in Unix, it will automatically update the last access time, and we don't want to do that because that will destroy perhaps valuable information. What was the last access time that we're interested in, and not when we last accessed the file. So that's why we make sure that we might need to bypass the operating system. Another reason that we want to bypass the operating system is that information might be hidden in that partition, as I told you before. So the operating system will not see it. So we need to go behind it and find everything that there is to know. Now, as far as the user data is concerned, they are at the application level. So they might need to be examined with special application tools, and they are not part of the file system analysis. So we need, if it's a CAD drawing, for example, that was produced by AutoCAD, we need to have somebody who understands AutoCAD open the file and tell us what's in it. So that's not part of the file system analysis, that's part of the application analysis. So, block is an ambiguous term because it's such a nice word that people use it for different things. And it all started by the fact that typically the hardware block size is 512 has been the case since the early days of the computing era. So a block on a diskette, on one of the early hard disk drives and one of the new hard disk drives is 512 bytes. Now, in the near future, we might up that to 4K, but today it's still 512. However, 512 is too small because if you have a lot of files, keeping track of all these tiny little blocks will clutter your file system. So most operating systems tend to cluster these blocks and create clusters that are bigger, that are essentially a linear collection of these blocks. So let's call these blocks sectors, and let's look at the file system blocks. And we see that, for example, Unix can have 2K, 4K blocks. Windows, again, could be 1K, 2K, 4K, some cases bigger. And in Windows notation, they're called clusters. In Unix notation, they're called blocks. But let's call them clusters for the time being to be able to differentiate them with the sectors. And address. Address is another term that is haunting us. And it's haunting us because of the way disks were constructed in the past. If you again took an operating system course, you'll have seen the graph with the platters and the heads, and you would have essentially cylinders that are defined by all these array of heads going into the disk and accessing the information in the platter, and the cylinder is the perpendicular blocks. All the blocks that can be accessed at the same time with the heads in a given position. So older operating systems, older machines use this analogy because in the old time it was important, and there were actually algorithms that the operating system used to optimize accessing, moving the heads in and out from the disk. Nowadays, all this is crap. We don't use that because modern disk drives have essentially their own operating systems inside them to optimize access. So even if we think we know what is the logical address of a block, we're probably wrong. And modern disk drives consider data as a linear array of sectors, and if we just give them a number, they will happily go and get it, and they tell us not to bother trying to optimize because we'll get it wrong. So, but still, a lot of old BIOS use that, and especially when you create a nice operating system, you install an operating system and you have to answer, weird questions like, how many heads does your disk drive have? And you get it wrong. You fill the installation, and when you try to remove it, it won't move. And this is bad. So now we've moved to the logical file system address. Again, this is the beginning. So we have taken our disk drive, we split it into slices, and within each slice is a file system, and this address, the logical file system address, is from the beginning of that slice. So here's another address. This is a relative address. And the important thing is that if we extract that partition from the disk drive and we move it to another disk drive, if we use these relative addresses, we will retain sanity. If we use absolute addresses, we will not. So most file systems use these logical file system addresses. And finally, there is the logical file address, which is the address of a data block relative to the beginning of the file. So again, if we have a database, which is a big file, we have to consider where the information is stored from the beginning of the file. And before I go there, and of course files are not stored contiguously in a partition, they are broken into chunks called clusters, and they are rearranged all over the place so that it's more convenient for the operating system. And since the late 70s, we don't have contiguous files in file systems, with the exception of CD-ROMs or DVD-ROMs, where we tend to have these contiguous files. But again, we don't see that. It's just the driver doing that for us. So, what kinds of stuff do we have in a file system? Well, we have obviously the data. I mean, that's why we have all the other stuff, because we need to store our data. So that's very important. Next is the names. So user data and user names. That's the stuff that the user can decide on, and from that point on, it's the operating system that deals with the rest. So the user gets to name the bag where his or her data is stored, and that can provide us with a lot of information as to what is inside the file. And then we have metadata, we have content data, and file system data. Let's look at them a little bit more closely. So, the length of the, so we need information about how the file system is constructed. So how much is a file, how many bytes is a file system block, or how many hard disk sectors is a file system block, how big is the file system, how many blocks are free so that we can allocate them for new files, and how can we get additional information about the file system. Usually in Unix notation, this would be part of the super block, and it definitely is, we definitely can find one copy at the beginning of the file system, and there might be additional copies spread all over the place for redundancy. Again, if we look at it at the disk drive, before we can start looking at, let's say that somebody gives you a disk drive that tells you there is a file called, secret information inside this disk drive, please get it for me. You will first have to look at the beginning of the disk to find out whether there are any slices created, how many file systems exist on that disk. Now, as a bonus, that little table that can have up to 4 entries also give you a number, which is the file system identification. So there is some list somewhere on the internet you can find of all possible values this field can have, and that corresponds to all kinds of weird file systems, file system types. So we have DOS with 12-bit FAT, we have DOS with 16-bit FAT, we have NTFS version 1, we have NTFS version 2, we have Unix System 5, we have Amiga DOS, and so on and so forth. All kinds of stuff. Amazingly, you can find it, like I said, on the internet. It's fun reading. So it also tells us where in the disk this slice exists. So we have the beginning and the length of that slice. So if we look in the disk and find out the string secret file somewhere there, we can find out which slice it belongs to, right? So now we know that it's in the second slice. And we look at the magic number and we know it's a Unix file system in that second slice. So we say, okay, let's see where we can find that thing. Now, we go to the beginning of that slice and we look at since we know we're talking about the Unix file system, we look for the super block. The super block will give us this general information. And that also tells us where is the root inode. The inode in the Unix file system tells you how a file is, how to get the data blocks of a file. I won't go into the specifics, but in its simplest form, you can think of it as an array that contains some useful metadata like the creation of the file. It does not contain the name of the file, but it contains when the file was last accessed, access permissions of the file, who is the owner, what group it belongs, and if the file is small, you get a number of addresses, logical file system addresses, where the first 10 blocks of the file can be found. These are the direct blocks. And from there, you can actually find out where that the first 10 blocks of the file exist, so you can actually look at them. And directories are constructed in the same way. So if you have this string secret file, you can do essentially a reverse lookup and find out which inode that string belongs to. So which data block corresponds to that file. And you can then find out by doing a traversal of the inode map to find out whether that it belongs to a directory or a file. So you see how you go from one piece of information to the next, and eventually it's like getting a very tight knot and slowly untangling it. And you can find out the file that is called secret file, and then you can find its blocks, and then you can read them. So that's how the operating system does it, and that's how we can do it if we want to do it our way, and not just mount it in an operating system that can understand this kind of files. The similar approach can be done with NTFS and FAT file systems, even with Amiga DOS. It's the same thing, trust me. Now, the largest part of the file system is it is better consumed by user data, otherwise it will be a very inefficient file system. Now, these are the data are allocated in file systems blocks, and there might be a linked list of allocated blocks, or there might be a linked list of unallocated blocks, and all the rest are considered to be allocated. So, in this way, we can identify which part of the disk, if we exclude the file system information and we exclude the unallocated blocks, then the rest is stuff that contains user data, and we can look at them, knowing where they exist in the file system. Now, metadata. Metadata is data about data. So typical information is where they exist, as I'm giving you some information about the inode. It also tells you the size of the file. Again, it's part of the inode in the Unix context. And then we can have a bunch of timestamps, last modified, last accessed, and when it was created. Unix inodes, FAT directories entries are examples of metadata. The file name, as I told you, might exist in a separate location, and it gives us a connection between the user notion of what the file contains and the contents of the file. So think of it as the host name and the IP address. So the IP address is a bunch of numbers that don't tell you a lot, but the host name might convey some information. The application data is not required for the file system to function, i.e. the file system doesn't care what you ask it to store. But we can get additional information from the file system journal, and if POTA is supported, from the POTA statistics. The journal is quite interesting because in journal file systems, if you pull the plug as the file system is being accessed, you don't lose everything because all the pending operations are stored in a journal. And when the system reboots, it looks at that journal and syncs that journal with the actual file system. So if some operation has not been done, it will be done based on the information stored in the journal. So that's how to get a system to reboot fast without losing information. But from the point of view of the forensic investigator, that tells you another big hint, is what operations were being done when the power was lost. So by looking at the journal, you saw the last, it's like a guy died and these are the last words they tell you before they die. So you look at the accesses before the crash or the loss of power. And by looking at that, you can see what were the last things it was trying to do before it died. Another important thing is what information is considered essential and what for the functioning of the operating system and what is considered non-essential. So consider the last access time of a file. This is nice to have, but it's not important for the functioning of the file system because it doesn't rely on this time to function. But the inode number associated with the file, well, that's important. So that is essential. So if you mess with the inodes, you are messing with essential information. If you mess with the last modified time, then you're messing with non-essential information. So the file system will be very concerned about preserving the essential information and may not be as intense in its efforts in preserving non-essential. So they might have a different reliability standard. Now, as I told you, critical file system data usually are stored in the beginning of a disk partition. This is done because we need a standard way to find this information. We don't want to go into some weird location in the middle of the partition to find this information. We'd rather have it in the beginning, so we can always find, look at it and find out how that thing is constructed. So that will give us the type of this file system, where we can get further information about the file system. These are trusted data because they're considered essential for the operation of the file system, and we can look at them with a hex editor. And we can get a first idea of what is stored in that partition. So the volume slack is what I've told you when the projector was refusing to cooperate, is space that is neither here nor there. It's not part of the partition, not part of the file system. So you have to be concerned about information being hidden there. Now, when you create a file, you have a bunch of data blocks allocated to it, and as the file grows, more data blocks are allocated to it. And when you take a block from the free list and you assign it to a file, you mark it as used, so it doesn't consider it, so the operating system does not use it for another purpose. And how you do that depends on the operating system and the file system. When you delete a file, all the blocks are taken back to the free list so that it can be reused, and the directory entry will have to be purged. Usually it's done in the most expeditious manner possible. I think MS-DOS simply zeroes the first byte of the file name in a fact table and moves the entire chain to the free list. So stuff remains. Even though you deleted the file, stuff remains. So they are unallocated. They are in the unallocated list, but if we pull the plug, they will not. The operating system will not have a chance to reuse them. So they're still there. And in some cases, especially if we have an allocation based on a linked list, if we find the first block of that file, if we go down the free list and we find the first block of that file, then we can know that all the following files until the end of it belong to that file. So we can take that chain of blocks extracted from the free list and put it back. So as I said, the file name might still remain a little bit mangled in the directory, and information such as last updated, last accessed might still remain there. So even though the file has been erased, it's not gone, it's still there. Especially with DOS, with fat partitions, it can be almost trivial to recreate. If you do a delete star.star in a fat file system, it might be, I can consider it trivial recreating these files. The more the file system goes and reuses this partition, the more information is lost. So it is important to stop this reuse of these deleted files, of the blocks that belong to the deleted files as soon as possible. And that takes us back to the argument between dead and live analysis. If we leave it live, it will start destroying all the information that was deleted. If we just pull the plug and take the disk out, we might be able to create perhaps everything that was deleted. So we search with the help of metadata, and the more metadata we can find, the better. And then we can try to find out the data blocks. As I said, the files are not contiguous, they're not stored contiguously, they are all over the place. So we have little chunks of the file, and we have to put it together again. So that might depend on how the file system is organized and how it was deleted and so on and so forth. It might be like solving a puzzle. We can do string searches for keywords. As I mentioned earlier, we want to find the file named secret file, so we can type it in and do a search, a grep, essentially of the entire partition. But we need to worry about this kind of splitting up. So if the beginning of the file name is one cluster and the end of the file name is in another cluster, then we won't find it, because the secret is at the end of one sector and the IO is in another sector somewhere else on the disk. So that's not going to work. So this might work fine if the string is within a sector or a file system block, but in many cases, if we're not lucky, we might not be able to find it. Signatures are very important. Very, very important. These are also called magic numbers in Unix notation. Essentially, the beginning of the file tells us what is stored in the file. In the MS-DOS or Windows world, it's the extension of the file that tells us what it's about. So a .doc is a Word file, an old Word file. A docx is a new Word file. A .pdf is a PDF file. But in Unix, if you look at the first few bytes of the file, that is the magic number for the signature, and it will tell you what the file is about. Also, MD4 sequences have some structure, and we can find, even if they are all over the place, hidden in a file, we can still recover them by looking at that particular structure. So we look at that, and we get, let's say, a few thousands of guesses. So we play them and try to find which is garbage and which actually is something, is video. So that's how we would look at a digital VCR with a hard disk drive to find out where are the films stored in it. I said the basic problem with the fragmentation, especially in the movies. As I said, each sequence is a few seconds, so you're trying to recreate a movie by splicing little segments a few seconds long. That can be very tedious. Machine learning techniques help us with that, because they can find out the last they can match the last frame of sequence A with the first frame of sequence B and splice them together. So automation does help. So I think blah, blah, blah. I think I've said most of that. So there are a bunch of utilities that can help us. For example, if I know the inode number, I can give a utility the partition and the inode number, and it can look at it and tell me which data blocks are associated with that inode. So you can do this kind of searches. The normal Unix file system will not allow you this, but if you go behind its back, you can do it. Here are the various slacks that I've talked to you during the projector break, so I won't repeat them. So let's look at that summary of unused space. So let's say that we have a data storage block size of 512 bytes and a file system block size of 4K, and we have a 26-byte file. So when we write that file into the disk, the file itself, the data, the user data, will be from location 0 to 25, because it's 26 bytes long. Now, from byte 26 onwards is hidden stuff, is unavailable stuff that we call it slack. So the RAM slack would probably be from byte 26 to byte 511, because that would be the buffer used by the operating system to do the write operation. And the file slack, here we have the file system block size. So the first 32 bytes of this 4K is the file, and the rest is the file slack. So again, from byte 26 to byte 4095 will be the file slack, and the drive slack is block oriented. So it will be, one block is allocated to the file, and the other blocks are free. So it will start from 512 and will go all the way to 4095. And this is information, this is essentially storage that is safe to use, but not visible. Encrypted files. Encryption can be used at various levels. We can have encryption at the file level, encryption at the operating system level, essentially at the file system level, encryption at the hard drive level. So modern ID drives, you can store a password there, and that password is going to protect the data unless you know the key. And in fact, one manufacturer, I think it's HP, is using this to force you to buy drives only from them. So the ID controller knows the key and unlocks the drive. So if you just buy a drive from Staples or from Amazon and you plug it in, it won't know the key, so it will be scrambled by it will get a key that it doesn't understand, and it will present a scrambled image to the controller, and the controller will say, this disk is unusable. So it's diabolical. So it goes both ways. So if you get, so again, the rule is trying to break the encryption is probably pointless, because it's usually too difficult anyway. So you have to break it somewhere else. Now, if it's a file protection, maybe the user is stupid enough to use a quick password, or you can use some human engineering to find out what the password is. But brute force attack on the password is probably wasted effort. Encryption at the file system level, we have TrueCrypt, EFS BitLocker for Windows, DMCrypt for Linux. Here the problem is that some file system data are present in plain text, so the operating system can access that partition. So you might be able to get some information from that encrypted file system, and decryption is as with file-based encryption, difficult. But again, subject to human engineering techniques. Now, if the computer has not been powered down, there might be some information stored in RAM. So if we can look at the RAM, if we can get a copy of the RAM and analyze it, we might get something, we might get the key stored there. So again, here is a plus point for not turning off the PC. You can see there are arguments both ways. Now, file deletion strategies. Now, most file systems just mark the entry as unused. They don't actively destroy the data associated with the file. They don't go and replace each sector that contains file system data with zeros, for example. They just mark it as unused, and if you do a global deletion, like del /s star in Windows, and it goes very quickly, it means that the files have not been erased, it has just been marked as unavailable. And that means that you can recreate them. So usually, because file systems want to be efficient, reconstructing deleted files is easy. And that also allows us to search keywords inside files or in directories. You might be able to find them. The metadata after the deletion of a file might still be around. So ILS is the list inode command, where you give it an image and it prints information about the inodes. The istat tool, you give it the inode number and the image containing the file system, and give you a printout of the inode associated with it. So there are commands that will help you deconstruct an image. Timestamps are quite important, because by looking at timestamps in different files, you can do the timelining, try to find out what is the sequence of actions an intruder took for the evil employee that stole files, for example. So it gives us important clues for the actions and the intent, perhaps, of the attacker. But we need to be aware that they're not considered essential data, so they're not preserved with the same effort as essential data. So let's look at the data blocks. We can access data blocks one by one and look at them and analyze their contents. We might do the analysis at the application level if we can string them together to form a file. And we must never forget the hidden parts of the disk where information might be hidden. And this takes us back to the journal, where we look at the recover information stored after a crash, and if we sometimes need to concentrate that to be able to find out what were the last actions that were taken before the crash. So journal analysis is quite popular recently. So that concludes this presentation. I think I've exceeded my time.
Slightly over time, but
Yeah.
we had problems.
But you told me.
Yeah.
So are there any questions? Proof proof by exhaustion.
So once you have recovered all the data and the files and stuff like that, are there any techniques that are appropriate to identify, for example, steganography? What if someone has hidden information inside files, and we retrieve the file, we see, okay, it's an image of the landscape or something, we skip this data.
Yeah.
But there is actual information inside.
Well, somewhere in these slides there is a disclaimer that says we only, in the file system analysis, will look at the up to the extracting the contents of the file, finding the blocks that constitute the file. Now, whether that is an encrypted file or whether that's stecanographically or it has stego information, at this level we cannot deal with it because we need to know, we need to do further analysis. And if you think of a computer containing, hundreds of thousands of images, doing a stego analysis on these to find hidden messages depends on who is the suspect, right? Usually, you find a file that is an encrypted zip file, and you have to convince the suspect to give you the key. And I remember in the States there was the case of a guy that had, something like child porn.zip.encrypted zip, and they told him, give us the password. They said, no, I'm going to give it to you. And the judge says, okay, I'll hold you in jail for contempt of court. 5 years later, he was still in jail for contempt of court, and he had to give them the password because they would just keep him locked up. Take his chances, perhaps arguing that these were not his files or whatever, but it was pointless. It's like the big stick principle. You have him there and you say, give me the password or I'll kick you. And in some regimes this works. In the case, there was another case. A journalist that was traveling from Germany to the United States was changing plane in Heathrow. Actually, it wasn't a journalist, it was the boyfriend of the journalist. But anyway, so some British police officers or security people approached him and said, we know that you're carrying a disk drive, we want it. We want your cell phone, and we want the passwords to unlock them. And he said, what if I don't give them to you? And he said, well, we'll keep you locked up until you do. And he said, okay, take them. And they allowed him to continue on his, keeping all that stuff with him. So, in some cases, it doesn't need a lot of technical analysis. You just need to threaten the suspect with, jail or something worse, and they'll give it to you. Any other questions?
Do SSD drives affect this process at all?
Yes and no. The thing with the SSD drive is that there is a layer underneath the controller layer that tries not to do a lot of write operations in the same sector. So if you manage to go beneath that layer, perhaps you can find a lot of data that are considered overwritten but have not been. So you might find previous instances of the file that you are dealing with. If you recall, there was this rather infamous case with a flash drive that the Greek Minister of Finance was supposed to have. It had a list of people that had foreign accounts, especially accounts in Switzerland. And they accused him of handing it over to law enforcement after having deleted the names of some of his relatives. And I can say that now because he was actually convicted in court. He didn't serve any time, but the conviction stands, so I can say that he did it without fearing being sued, because the court has decided he did do that. But I was astounded by the discussion about that flash drive, because as I told you, if if they've kept messing with that drive and just gave it to somebody who knew what they were doing, they might have been able to find out whether there were instances of that Excel file with the names of his relatives or not. So they would have been able to do quite a thorough analysis of that flash, rather than sticking it in an ordinary Windows computer and looking at access dates, which is what they did. But again, it depends on, well, the approach worked because it convinced the court. Now, perhaps another court would have might have had different ideas, but we don't know, because the case is now done. So, yes.
Okay, so another question, I would like to sum some things up together. So if I was someone that wanted to have, let's say, child pornography or something else that...
This is hypothetical, right?
Yeah, completely.
You don't store this in your...
No. So, and I know that forensic analysis exists, so I want to protect myself. Okay.
Let the record show that his advisor doesn't know anything about
Okay.
this.
I want to point out some stuff. Like, for example, what if I have a custom firmware, okay, loaded on the drive? What if I have a RAID 0 with some couple of disks and I just pull out one before police comes in and destroy this disk? The RAID is useless.
Yes.
And
It wouldn't be much of a RAID if you could do that.
It's
Yeah.
useless. What are you talking about?
It's supposed to be a redundant array.
Yeah.
So if you remove one disk, it will still reconstruct the others.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you're storing child porn, that's how you should do it.
And let's say, what happens when someone has some pretty custom stuff going on with his system and it's not really straightforward to pull out its disks? Or for example, temporary file systems like Samsung does with Rapid, where some stuff are buffered in the RAM, so if they shut down the PC, nothing gets right back to the disk.
Yeah, you are overcomplicating. It could be like all you need is, you know, your cell phone with your secret stuff to have a non-standard battery connector, because if they arrest you and you don't have the charger with you, they will, by the time they find the connector that is suitable with that's compatible with your cell phone, it would have died, may have died. So just being a little bit incompatible with the rest of the universe might be sufficient, because these police departments are overworked. So they have standard tools, approved tools with all kinds of stamps. They are, you know, trustworthy and they don't mess with the evidence. So if you give them something that is non-standard, your own version of, you know, Rise FS or, you know, Acorn Disk FS from the early 90s, they might get so confused and give up in disgust. I mean, that's what was happening with the digital video recorders. It was a disaster for law enforcement because all these things had proprietary stuff. The runtime environment was totally proprietary, and they didn't have access to it. So they got a disk, and the disk was garbage. So they had to go and hire somebody like me to take the disk and make sense out of it. And if the investigator is charging by the hour, it might be a very expensive proposition for a police department that is stressed, you know, with resources. So usually what they do is they go to the suspect and say, you know, something really bad is going to happen to you unless you tell us, you know, where you need. You know, essentially what they would do, they would find caches of hard drives, but they would not find the machine that would access them. So it's, you know, something totally stupid. Like, you know, instead of taking out the disk drive and destroying it, you just destroy the RAID controller and, you know, obliterate the ROM with the software, and then they wouldn't be able to access it. So in your case, you know, have a RAID controller with your own firmware, and then when the police comes in, you take out the ROM and squash it, might be your best alternative. Because they won't have the time to go and do that stuff. They might beat you and tell them what you've done, but, you know, take your chances there. Or they might lock you up. They might say, you know, you know how it's done, and until you tell us how it was done, we'll keep you locked up. So you might have to re-engineer your special controller in jail. So yeah, but like I said, these guys want to go for mainstream. If it's outside the mainstream, they'll get very annoyed, and that might be good or bad. You want to piss off the police, give them something non-standard. Other questions?